Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to what I'm astonished to say is the last of my 6 lectures on men, women, and guitars in Romantic England, and that completes my first year as Gresham Professor of Music. I recognize many of your faces, and as I've said more than once, thank you very much for your loyalty over the months, and I hope that when I turn to a wholly different subject, which will be music, imagination, and the Middle Ages, next session, I might see some of you again. With your permission, I'd like to dedicate this lecture to a Danish guitarist whom I much admire, Lars Herdelius Stikkertsen. And let me begin by introducing the 2 musicians who are here who are going to play for us, Ulrich Wedemeyer and Grace Davidson. And I'd like your permission for something else. There have been many pieces performed in the course of these lectures, very evanescent and fleeting, some of them, you may well have thought, and you would have been right. So what I'd like to do for this last lecture is something slightly different. There are 2 rather fine songs we're going to hear today, and what I'd like to do is what is sometimes done, of course, in performances of very new music. That is to perform them twice. Now, not immediately one after the other, but after a pause, so that you really have a chance to recognize what's happening in the song. My intention, as you can see, is to send you out of my last lecture whistling, if I possibly can. Now, the first page of your handout, if you've all got one, shows an illustration taken from one of the many instruction books for the guitar, published in London during the first half of the 19th century. This particular one dates from 1819. Now, the author, Charles Sola, gives some basic instructions about the guitar. They're actually very basic and wouldn't absolve the buyer from having to employ Mr. Sola to give lessons for all the things that he's left out. Then he gives a small anthology of pieces. Now, you'll have noticed at once, of course, that the performer is a woman. She's elaborately dressed as if for a soirée in elite company, and she's sitting on that most characteristic piece of Regency furniture, the sofa or chaise longue on which you could recline in a state of romantic reverie or indolence. Now, to judge by this and other engravings to be found in these guitar tutors, which, as I say, there was really quite a lot published in London in the early 19th century, these manuals, like this one, were very often addressed to women. And my subject today is the guitar and the fair sex. Now, in the judgment of some contemporaries, as you can imagine, this association between the guitar and female amateurs meant that the instrument was deemed to be quite unfit for men. And that was part of a broader conviction shared by many that a gentleman, my dear, a gentleman, should not stoop to perform any kind of music at all. Here's a passage from the Morning Post for December 1829. There is, we know, a very natural prejudice against men becoming musicians, and ardently as we are attached to the art and impressed with its importance, we confess that we cannot see a man sit down to the piano or take a guitar in his hand without an involuntary feeling of degradation. Well, there could scarcely be, don't you think, a better illustration of the dangers we court when we think that anything in social customs or attitudes is natural. What appears evident and natural to one generation may seem odd and even offensive to their descendants when constructions of masculine and feminine identity have shifted. So my purpose today is to explore the ways in which the guitar was associated in the early 19th century with a female identity, and to examine the ways in which women used the guitar to achieve ends they were under pressure to accomplish, however those pressures might arise from outside or from within themselves. Now, throughout our period, it was widely believed, I suspect that it's still believed by many, that women could bring to musical performance, as too much else, a free play of emotion animated by feeling and sympathy. Men, in contrast, were associated with the rational powers they needed for their large fields of action beyond the home, in politics or commerce. Now, just in case you think that this is a characteristic piece of male sexism, that view is one that many intelligent and articulate women in the early 19th century were quite happy to endorse. Here, for example, is one of the most influential female writers of the period and a major figure in the revival of evangelical Christianity, Hannah More, who died in 1837. She writes, "In all that captivates by imagery or warms by just and affecting sentiment, women are excellent. They possess in a high degree that delicacy and quickness of perception, that nice discernment between the beautiful and the defective, which comes under the denomination of taste. Both in composition and action, they excel in details, but they do not so much generalize their ideas as men, nor do their minds seize a great subject with so large a grasp." Well, the second page of your handout shows an undated fashion plate. The original is actually in color, probably of the early 1800s, with two women performing an accompanied song for voice and guitar. This is from my own collection. They're both dressed in light and diaphanous colors, perhaps for a summer's day. The singer, who raises her hand as if to express what Hannah More calls just and affecting sentiment, is perhaps performing an Italian song. For as one essayist observed in 1821, and I quote, "Italian song has a grace, a pathos peculiar to itself. It flows, as it were, without effort from the lips, rising or falling in sighing slides and sprinkled with emphatic appoggiaturas, now sinking into a low murmur, now swelling into firmness and vigor, and it is admirably assisted by the throbbing arpeggios, the full or feeble chords, and the silken notes of the indolent guitar." Although many contemporary viewers, including I think many women, would have seen our fashion print as a celebration of women's gifts, grace, emotional sensitivity, and elegance by right of gender, the musical talent of women was widely understood to be limited by what Hannah More calls that failure to seize a great subject with so large a grasp. The high level of proficiency that some women undoubtedly achieved, for example, as amateur pianists, often taking lessons with some of the great male concert performers of the day, didn't modify the view expressed in a great many poems, novels, and indeed fashion plates like ours, that women show their excellence in music with a delicate touch on the harp, the piano, or the guitar, or with a sentimental ballad, not by taking part in a string quartet or performing a concerto, the musical equivalent of a great subject requiring a larger grasp. Well, before we go any further, it's time to hear, I think, the combination of female voice and an earlier romantic guitar. This is a song, "Oh, If Those Eyes Deceive Me Not," and it was published in May's Introduction to the Spanish Guitar, published between about 1827 and 1829. That was, I think, a particularly pleasing example of a kind of song really published in their hundreds. This is a very, very substantial repertoire. Well, as you may be starting to guess, the story of women and their transactions with the guitar in the period that concerns us today cannot be an entirely happy tale. After all, when men made music in Romantic England, they often did so away from the home, playing ensemble works in gatherings whose history is deeply involved with the evolution of all-male clubs and societies from the 17th century onwards. A man went to such meetings with a melody instrument such as a cello and a violin or an oboe, and you might expect to meet there a professional or two, perhaps a singing man from the local church or cathedral who was a good violinist, a versatile organist who played the bassoon. A woman, in contrast, might certainly have visitors or indeed go visiting, and there could be music if she did, but it's highly revealing that the instruments insistently associated with women's musical amateurism, the piano, the harp, the guitar, were all self-sufficient and therefore suited to solitude, or if you prefer, to confinement. The vogue for the guitar, an instrument that yielded as it still does results relatively quickly to those of modest talent or ambition, was therefore related to a much more general and insidious narrowing of what women were encouraged to believe they could encompass, or of what life could offer. By the 1830s, many families, this is easy to prove, were wealthier than their grandparents had been, with the result that substantial numbers of women, especially amongst the what's called the middling sort. Historians are, as I'm sure you know, very nervous about using the term middle class for this period, but from the middling sort, withdrew from the labour force because they were more prosperous. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that they ceased to be working women. You could hardly describe a woman who spent perhaps 4 years of every 5 pregnant and who supervised the running of the home as not a working woman. But with prosperity came, of course, more domestic servants to bear some of the other burdens: housemaids, a nurse, a governess, a footman, a cook. Now, to be sure, these could add much to wifely responsibility, making the management of a home a particularly complex affair. But while a woman remained unmarried, it could be very different. A Frenchman who visited Brighton in the early 1830s was astonished. Incidentally, he was astonished by a lot of things, but he was particularly astonished to find the young women of a wealthy family whom he visited copying extracts from books on geography and history as part of their home education, but learning nothing connected with the running of a household. Well, perhaps they were exceptional, or he misjudged them, I don't know, but I don't think it can be entirely wrong to suppose that there was a large population of unmarried women in comfortable homes with no task of greater importance before them than to gain a husband or to while away their lives if they found none. We meet one of the latter in Dickens' Bleak House with Miss Volumnia. I quote, "She had a pretty talent for cutting ornaments out of coloured paper and also for singing to the guitar in the Spanish tongue, but she didn't have a talent for much else." Incidentally, one of the things that really astonished our Frenchman in Brighton, because I could tell that slightly intrigued you, was the English passion for fresh air. He simply could not understand it. He went out for an early morning walk and came back only to find that the maid had thrown open the window in his chamber on a November morning. And when asked, "Why have you done this? Pourquoi vous avez fait ça, mon Dieu, pourquoi?" He was told quite simply, "Well, sir, one has to breathe." The guitar had its place in the hunt for a husband, in which Miss Volumnia failed. The third page of your handout shows a print of a young woman with a guitar based upon a portrait by Chalon, which was exhibited in 1831. I venture to say that tastes have changed to the point where the picture now seems really rather mawkish and saccharine. Indeed, I would say off the record, though nothing is off the record since these lectures are being filmed, that this really is woman as poodle. The critic, however, who saw the original picture found much to admire, although we should remember, of course, that he was looking at the original. He found that the picture reveals, and I quote, a woman of elegant and coquettish air with a certain Gallic sprightliness about her, a fair, fashionable, touching a guitar and looking archly at the spectator. She has a roguish sparkle in her eye and an answering smile upon her lips. The roses, fancifully placed in the dark tresses, have an agreeable effect. Well, our critic, it seems to me, is allowing himself to be drawn by an image of woman as seductress that's all the more tantalizing for the deep male anxieties about female sexuality and the allure that the image has the power to stir, but not too much. How many young women in search of a husband took up the guitar to comply with this controlling male fantasy of womanhood seen without the dulling effects of age or marriage? What choice did they have if they did not wish to? After all, many passages in poems, novels, and serialized fiction extolled the virtues of the guitar-playing minx, as in this passage from a novel of 1832, which says, "Young Jacintha was esteemed a complete mistress of the guitar, and in the opinion of all the neighborhood accompanied it with a voice of unparalleled sweetness, and withal could indulge as she sang and played in the most eloquent and seducing glances." The posture of a seated woman with a guitar was evidently considered to be very appealing indeed, elegant and poised, with the curves of one answering to the roundness of the other. The vogue for the guitar among women therefore arose, I think, in some part from the constant subjection of women to a social gaze that was often sexual if it came from men, and highly competitive and critical when it came from other women. Now here, the guitar was deemed to have an advantage. Of the three instruments commonly associated with a female amateur, I remind you of the harp, the piano, and the guitar, the piano soon was disparaged on the grounds that it made no show of posture. Thus, according to an essay of 1811, and I quote, "The attitude at a pianoforte or at a harpsichord is not so happily adapted to grace. From the shape of the instrument, the performer must sit directly in front of a straight line of keys, and our own posture being correspondingly erect and square, it's hardly possible that it should not appear rather inelegant." But it was otherwise with the guitar. So, in a pen portrait of a woman from 1802, I quote, "As her voice was charming in itself, so it was improved by art, and aided by the soft touches of the guitar, which she handled with inimitable grace, and preferred to all other instruments, as the attitude of playing upon it is most advantageous for the discovery of a fair lady's gentility." Notice that it's not just that it reveals a good figure. The posture with the instrument actually reveals your gentility. It reveals your breeding. It reveals something intangible about you that money cannot buy. The final page of your handout shows a caricature by William Heath, published in London around about 1828. This was incidentally one of a number of pictures sent to me by members of this audience, and I'm very grateful to you for the materials that you have sent to me and for your various messages as the lectures have proceeded. You can see a man and woman who are fashionably dressed, indeed overdressed, that's part of the satire, are shown performing the song "Hope Told a Flattering Tale," which is quite well known. The soloist is male. He stands and is evidently enjoying a certain freedom of movement, which you can see the artist is determined to satirize. But the lady with the guitar, though sitting upright, seems, I think you'd agree, extremely poised and very careful about the grace and the subtlety of her appearance. And now, let's hear that very song. Although, as a bid for women's autonomy, we're going to reverse the gender of singer and player. We're going to hear this song, Hope Told a Flattering Tale, which incidentally is from an opera, La Molinara, and this was published by a guitarist and violinist called Chabran, who worked for the Italian Opera at the Haymarket in London. So this is a transcription of an operatic aria. So you're going to hear it first in the Italian, because it was originally in Italian, nel cor non più mi sento, and then you're going to hear the English. So let us hear it. There was, in fact, a great deal in contemporary poetry, serialized fiction, and published novels to encourage women to see themselves as guitarists, to look at how they were postured and how they were playing. We even find it, in fact, in reviews of music. Here's a review, a quote, a passage from. "We cannot help observing the powerful inducement to ladies to learn the guitar, which the publisher of this music has ingeniously added to the author's preface." He writes, "For the display of graceful attitude, the guitar is admirably well calculated, and when in the hands of an accomplished female, a skillful performance on it gives fascination to beauty by affording such opportunities for uniting graceful action to elegance of person as perhaps no other instrument possesses." Can any lady, we ask ourselves, resist these instances and not purchase Mr. Lindsay's publication in gratitude for such a recommendation? The lived experience of women, their inner life as amateurs of the guitar from day to day, is hard to perceive, as you can imagine, beneath the many and varied attempts, often by men, but not entirely, to regulate and shape female comportment and behavior. Too many of the sources we possess were written by fathers, husbands, or brothers in a spirit of correction, satire, or sheer misogyny. Or were written by women who imitated, often anonymously, the printed voice of their dominant male counterparts. In too many self-satisfied essays and novels, male writers parody what they find to be the vacuous conversation of young daughters who, as it may now seem to us, had sometimes been systematically starved of the mental food they needed to do better. Another problem with many of our documents, especially poetry and fiction, is the sentimentality with which women and their needs were often imagined, combined with an impoverished sense of how a woman might live an autonomous and nourishing existence without either loneliness or languor. A woman abandoned, alone, or somehow isolated without comforts was a favourite theme of contemporary fiction, as every reader of Jane Eyre knows. But it flows over the boundaries of fiction into social commentary. Here's an author, for example, of 1829, expressing herself very much in favour of women having accomplishments such as some musical ability, because, and I quote, "Sometimes a husband is obliged to be frequently and for long periods absent from home. Sometimes there are no children to interest the feelings and occupy the time and the attention of a married woman. In such cases, her requirements and information may be as companions to her, whiling away the hours of solitude which would otherwise be spent in listlessness, indolence, and discontent." Well, that seems to be earnest and pragmatic advice, but there's surely more than a shadow there of the ennui, the languor that besets, for example, Tennyson's Mariana, a poem from a later period, describing a woman living alone in a neglected house while waiting for a lover who never comes. And I can't resist reading you a stanza. "With blackest moss the flower pots were thickly crusted one and all. The rusted nails fell from the knots that held the pair to the garden wall. The broken sheds looked sad and strange. Unlifted was the clinking latch. Weeded and worn the ancient thatch upon the lonely moated grange. She only said, 'My life is dreary. He cometh not,' she said. She said, 'I am aweary, aweary. I would that I were dead.'" That woman really needs a guitar. But you see what I mean, I think. Indeed, if she had wanted one, all she had to do was to buy one and look through a local music shop for a vast quantity of melodious and appealing song, to which I alluded earlier, was published for voice and guitar. Quite a bit of it in the method books, of which we had an example on the very first page of our handout. So I'd like you to hear, this is the second repeat performance of the song that we heard at the very beginning, "Oh, If My Eyes Deceive Me Not," from May's Instructions for the Spanish Guitar, published, I remind you, 1827 to 1829.
Thy heart will leave me
the accompaniment to that piece, say I, who didn't have to play it, was relatively straightforward. But some women did undoubtedly reach a very, very high standard on the guitar, confounding the notion that the guitar, like a sweet wine, was a very good sort for ladies. Already by 1814, even before Waterloo, a novel had been published entitled The Spanish Guitar, whose main theme seems to be, and I quote, "Music is an engaging and now too fashionable a science, but like other things, it is often perverted for young ladies who used to amuse their friends with a few simple songs now perform like professors, like their teachers." Well, at a more modest level of achievement, the guitar had a secure place in the culture of theatre and opera songs. That's, after all, what we heard the song just before this one. Valued by many, and probably the musical food that most middle-class homes preferred to consume on a regular basis, despite what a newly emergent breed of newspaper critics might maintain about the infinite superiority of the great masterworks emerging from Germany. There were even those who were prepared to oppose those critics on their own ground. Listen to this. But this instrument, meaning the piano, is the least interesting of all in its tones. It's costly, cumbrous, requires immense practice to excel on, and with common playing is simply not worth listening to. As an accompaniment for the voice, it has not half the beauty of more facile ones, and vocal music has such fascination that even an air with a guitar would, in 99 instances out of 100, draw away the listeners collected around a performer of Beethoven's crudities on a 150 rosewood brass embossed 6-octave grand piano. Beethoven's crudities. That really makes the hair stand on end, doesn't it? But that is the view of someone who, I suppose, whose ears had been shaped by an essentially 18th century sound world when instruments were in many respects rather quieter and the rhetoric of music often rather more civil. Well, in an attempt to get closer to the actual experience of women with the guitar, I'd like to spend the latter part of this lecture looking in one particular direction, which I think is completely new. I don't think it's been done before, which is the adoption of the guitar by members of the governess class, Jane Eyre, if you like. I'm trying to avoid the joke about the air guitar, but I haven't quite avoided it. Now, by a governess, I mean a woman who resided with a family as a teacher of languages and of accomplishments such as drawing or music, or who visited families to perform those duties for an hour or two at a time, called a day governess. Now, both kinds were prominent in early 19th century England, whence, of course, their strong presence in fiction. Becky Sharp in Thackeray's Vanity Fair, Mrs. Weston and Jane Fairfax in Jane Austen's Emma, and, of course, Jane Eyre. Now, in some respects, governesses are not always easy to distinguish from schoolmistresses, who are often called governesses too. And a good position in a school, I think, was what many young women seeking a position as a governess would really have preferred. There was no question then of them being treated condescendingly by the matriarch of a family, or facing the hostility of domestic servants below stairs, who might regard a governess as a woman who gave herself airs but was actually no better than themselves. As one servant says to another in Vanity Fair, "I don't trust them governesses. They give themselves the airs and upstarts of ladies, and their wages is no better nor you and me." So what do we know about these women? The answer is a remarkable amount, because they advertised in the newspapers and often gave an address where an inquiry could be made. They advertised themselves, in other words, as ready to teach the guitar as a governess. Now, a woman could arrange with a bookseller, a local post office, a station or a music shop to serve as the reply address, or she could devise an advertisement and leave it for collection in one of the recognized collection points, which was often a coffee shop. Now, it's interesting that many of the bookshops that the women used as the reply address were in prestigious areas like Kensington, Pall Mall, or New Bond Street, suggesting the kind of clientele they hoped to attract. Unfortunately, of course, they never give their names. In common with standard practice at the time, they merely give their initials, which are often patently false, such as ABC or XYZ. The 1830s, remember, are the time of that wonderful story by Charles Dickens, The Boarding House, where Mrs. Tibbs places an advertisement for lodgers, and Dickens writes, "Answers out of number were received with all sorts of initials. All the letters of the alphabet seemed to be seized with a sudden wish to go out boarding and lodging. Most profound was the secrecy observed." As Dickens says, this kind of business, seeking paid work, was conducted behind a curtain of anonymity as a matter of social custom and discretion. And before I proceed, this is the moment for our final performance, which is the second performance of Hope Told a Flattering Tale and its Italian original, Nel cor non più mi sento. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I would welcome your opinion on this, and perhaps after the lecture you will give it to me. But it seems to me that what performances like that do demonstrate is the early 19th century guitar really is a superb accompanying instrument for the voice. It lays down a carpet of chords for a beautiful voice to walk over with a particular discretion and delicacy that was clearly very much valued at the time. And I think of the governesses, to which we now return, that's very much the art, essentially, that they really were teaching. They're not teaching their pupils to become great soloists, but to learn how to accompany a song in an effective manner. And I thought it was a good place to have that song, because that was, after all, a song about hope. Hope told a flattering tale. And clearly, many of these governesses placed their advertisements in the newspapers with hopes that were not realized, because you can trace them advertising again and again and again, having clearly not found any employment. Now, the advertisements show that most of these governess guitarists who took up the guitar as a way of making a living, they were teaching other things as well, of course, French, languages, a little bit of dancing perhaps, were in their early 20s. Indeed, a German lady about 26 years of age is the oldest that I've been able to find. As to their backgrounds, when a woman gives a bookseller's shop as a reply address, obviously we can't go any further, but they do sometimes give a private address. And then, that's where the fun starts. With the aid of contemporary documents, directories, and other sources, it's possible to pursue many of them, and the results attest to a massive constituency for the guitar in homes of the middling sort. The addresses, once we hunt them down, include the house of a bootmaker, a middle-rank married householder with a footman, a parlourmaid and cook. There's the house of a surgeon, a parson, a carpenter, a trunk and Venetian blind maker, a wholesale hosier, a turner and toy maker, a china and glass man, a head waiter at a hotel, a geographical engineer and surveyor, a corn factor, a solicitor, a wine and spirit and liquor merchant. Some give provincial addresses: Tame, Southampton, the post office at Bungay in Suffolk and Bath, but the vast majority are here in London, ranging from Cheapside, not far from here of course, St Dunstan's Hill and Holborn, really not far from here, to suburbs such as Pentonville, the houses around the village of Hampstead and Chelsea. There's quite a strong showing from south of the river: Kennington Lane, Clapham, Lambeth, Wapping, Stockwell, Brixton, Walworth and Camberwell. Now, teaching, whether as a governor or schoolmistress, was one of the few paid occupations a woman could have and remain a lady. When undertaken by a woman, it was, as you can imagine, widely regarded as a fundamentally maternal process, an expression of a woman's, here's that word again, natural role as a mother. A woman might have many reasons for needing the income she could get as a governess: the risky investments of a husband, brother or son, overextended credit leading to spectacular bankruptcies, there were plenty of those, bereavement, loss of parents, desertion, widowhood. One of our governess guitarists, for example, says openly in her advertisement that she has, and I quote, recently lost her surviving parent. Another loftily and perhaps truthfully announces, I quote, she says, that she was born and educated to superior expectations, but has been compelled by circumstances to advertise for a position. Yet another says she's been recommended a change of climate on medical grounds and would prefer an engagement with a family in Italy, the south of France or Madeira. Quite. Many women hope to secure a home in the medium term where they might be treated with a modicum of consideration and respect. One of our guitarists placed an advertisement in 1832 announcing that she possessed a small independence, that's to say, of course, a small income of her own, and therefore emolument is not so much the object as a comfortable home. Something very painful about that. Another in 1835 says she would be happy to engage herself without a salary with a family going to the continent, her travelling expenses being allowed her, together with the opportunity of accompanying the family to various places they may think worthy of notice. There is a wealth of humiliation and unhappiness known to many a governess behind that modestly expressed wish to be included in trips to beauty spots. Well, our governess guitarists were obviously seeking paid work, which means a measure of independence at a time when many historians have seen a narrowing of middle-class, there I will use the term, middle-class women's opportunities outside the home and domesticity. A place as a governess, which was essentially a position as teacher and childminder, could often be fraught with misery and unhappiness. Jane Eyre is present throughout this section, isn't she? But it was nonetheless a developing source of employment for women in early 19th century Britain. And in that regard, the rising fashion for the Spanish guitar in the 1820s and 1830s was not necessarily a source of confinement, turning women yet further into caged songbirds in their own homes, though that's arguably the impression that some of the images in the guitar methods give, like the one I began with. Instead, the guitar was a means, when added to others, to secure some income and at least a limited autonomy. Governesses with musical knowledge and an ability to teach musical instruments were among the most favoured of their class. In Jane Austen's novel Emma, for example, Mrs. Elton says to Jane Fairfax, "Your musical knowledge alone would entitle you to name your own terms, have as many rooms as you like, and mix in the family as much as you choose." Now, in just one example of the 70 or 80 that I know. Just one case. I can lift the veil of anonymity. Unlike the majority of women who advertised for a post as a governess, a certain M.K., who advertised in 1833, did not pay a stationer or a bookseller to receive her replies. Instead, she decided to identify her family home in a genteel quarter of London, 17 Foley Place, Cavendish Square. The Blue Book for 1833, a directory of London gentry and aristocracy, lists the occupier of that house in 1833 as a surgeon named George Knowles. His will, proved on the 24th of October, 1838, describes him as an apothecary with 2 daughters, Jane and Martha. So M.K. is Martha Knowles. In 1812, the year Napoleon hurled his army against Russia, Martha was baptized in the nonconformist Scotch church in Wells Street, so she came from a dissenting family. She was therefore about 21 years old when she placed her advertisement. Her musical talents with pianoforte and guitar were clearly somewhat advanced. Her advertisement shows that she was willing to give, and I quote, instruction in the pianoforte and guitar alone, which sounds like a bid to broaden her options beyond a strictly private and domestic context to a boarding school. Her father, being an apothecary and surgeon, was approximately the equivalent of a general practitioner today. It was not an especially genteel occupation, as anyone who knows the kind of scorn directed against another trained apothecary, John Keats, will recognize. But it was a profession. So given the relatively genteel position of her father in 1833, it seems very likely that Martha Knowles went willingly into a highly competitive market. I end with an enigma. It is remarkable, really, how little historical context our sources can offer for a striking advertisement that appeared in an issue of the Times for 1827. This announces that 2 sisters have taken lodgings and now invite applications from 3 or 4 ladies who might wish to share the accommodation with them. Quote, their object being society and not emolument. All applicants, if accepted, will have the use of a harp, guitar, and pianoforte. Here are women, evidently as yet unmarried, perhaps with no intention of becoming so, who wish to live companionably with other women and to enjoy music at home. One wonders, in such a context as that, what the ability of the guitar to give fascination to beauty or to make a woman appear as a tuneful treasure would have meant. I don't know. Thank you very much.